Good morning. And my name is Tim Jackson. 2 years ago, I was in a meeting, which was a private meeting with a number of VCs in Silicon Valley. And there was something which really astounded me that I heard from a top VC from San Francisco. The message was this: 75%, she said, of the companies that we invest in, we replace the CEO before we exit. I was surprised by this because the number was a great deal different from what I'd expected. But actually, when I looked back on my own career in the startup ecosystem, I realized that actually it is much closer to the truth than most people realize. I've been a startup founder myself. I started a company which I then took to an IPO on the NASDAQ and the London Stock Exchange. I've been a venture investor running big investments, late stage, Series B and Series C, with a $750 million fund in European tech. And I've been a seed investor. I currently run a fund called Walking Ventures, which invests in seed stage startups before Series A. But one of the things that I've learned in the course of that working life and the time that I spend now coaching CEOs is that the job of being a CEO is very different as the company progresses. Just in the very early stages, think about it. What kind of skills do you need to be the person who will quit your day job and decide to passionately go and pick a product and build it and start something? Slightly different from the skills, perhaps, that you need to find 5 other people and persuade them that they should quit their jobs and join you as well, and to raise enough money to build a minimum viable product. Then imagine a few months further on, you're now at a stage where you've got maybe 25 people on the payroll, and now the 5 or 6 people that report to you are themselves managers, and it is your role to help them manage the teams of people who work for them. And then a further stage on, 6 months later, you may well be in a position where you have 100 people, and the consequence is that now you have to put in place some structures without fully killing the entrepreneurial nature of the business. There was a bloke in 1969 called Peter who came up with the idea that people are typically promoted to one level above the job for which they are competent. And if you think about it, it's not surprising, because if you do your job well, you get a promotion. And if you don't do your job well, then you don't get promoted. In traditional companies, which are quite bureaucratic, if you underperform in your job, then you're quite likely just to stay in the job. And that's why so many large companies are filled with people who have been promoted just to the point of their own incompetence. But venture capital is slightly different, because venture capital investors are activists. And there's a great deal to play for when you're an investor in a company that could go extremely well or could go badly. Now, most of you will know from your own experiences in startups that venture capitalists have got a long list of rights to interfere in the business, typically called consent rights. And they're typically on 2 levels. One is the rights that the director on the board has. You know, here's 13 things you can't do without my approval, no matter how many other people on the board might vote for it. And then a separate set of rights for them as a shareholder, where you can't do stuff unless our fund as a shareholder agrees to do the following things. And yet, paradoxically, venture capital investors, even though they're very activist, they don't have nearly as much information as you would expect from being an entrepreneur about what's going on in the business. And that's partly because founders and CEOs are inevitably optimists. If you weren't an optimist, how could you possibly have quit your job and moved to do a startup? And they find it very tempting to give upbeat news when they're reporting on what's going on in the company in monthly or bi-monthly or quarterly board meetings. And the consequence of that effect is that actually VC investors have got surprisingly little that they can do to change the course of the business. But they do have one power, and it's a power that it's important for you to be aware of. The power they have is the ability to fire the CEO. Now, when you're a startup entrepreneur, it's very tempting to think of venture capitalists as kind of evil geniuses. But when you've been on the other side of the table, you realize that actually venture capitalists are very often people who are investing other people's money. They've raised money from institutions or from educational foundations or high net worth families. And they have gone to them and said, I'm very expert in startups. I know a great deal about the ecosystem. I can help pick fantastically good companies, and I can support those companies as they grow. The basic economics of venture, as you know, are 2 and 20. that a venture capital fund gets a fee of 2% a year of the funds that they're investing as a management fee, and they get a 20% share of the profits once they pass a hurdle. Paradoxically, the majority of European venture funds don't ever get that profit share, or carry as it's called. And so they're working pretty hard to find new investments, to do their best with the companies that they've invested in, and to find ways to exit successfully from the investments that they put money into. So what that means is that when you think about how a typical venture capitalist is actually dividing their time, there's probably a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split between scouting new investments, working with existing portfolio companies, and figuring out exits. And then on top of that, there's a 4-year cycle in which they are supposed to be raising new funds. And what that really means is that if you are sitting in your board meeting and you have an investor who's there and you're noticing that they are flipping through the board pack with suspicious signs that actually they have not read this carefully beforehand, and they're in fact winging it, you may well be right. And therefore, even though it may be the case that 75% of CEOs get replaced, the venture capitalist is not the obvious candidate that you would think of as somebody to lead a coup d'etat, somebody who's going to organize an overthrow of the government. So how does it happen? Well, I would say it typically happens in 4 stages, and the 4 stages take a year. The first stage is that if you're a CEO and you're not really keeping pace with the growth of the business, it will typically take 1 quarter, 3 months, for your kind of inability to keep up to begin to show itself in the numbers. That may be in terms of customer acquisition costs, or in revenue growth, or in terms of what's happening with customer churn, or what's happening with your ability to hire and retain good people. But typically you expect it to take a month before it becomes visible to you as CEO that things aren't going as well as you might hope. It then typically takes a 2nd month before the board and your investors begin to read between the lines of your reporting and notice what's going on. A 2nd quarter, I mean. So by now you're at 6 months. It then takes a 3rd quarter for the investors on the board to get together and say, hey, we really need to do something about this. And typically at that point, if they replace the CEO, it'll take a further quarter in order to get a new CEO in. So the paradox is that actually replacing a CEO, if you're a venture capitalist, takes a long time. It takes a year. It also entails mammoth disruption, because of course you're going to look like the bad guy if you try and do it. And the CEO will most likely be supported by the team. And it's expensive too. So although it might be tempting to think that that's what's going on, and that venture capitalists are somehow plotting when they're thinking about replacing CEOs, actually the situation is that they're very often somewhat at sea themselves and simply trying to make the best of what they can. Now, in the experiences that I've had investing in 50-odd startups, I've noticed a range of skills that I've seen held in common by CEOs who manage successfully to build their businesses and to scale their companies swiftly. What I would say is, and by the way, I'd be happy to share this list of skills with you if it would be helpful. And you can email me at tim@walking.vc and I'll share a sheet of it with you. What's striking about those skills is that most people who acquire them via the experience of spending 10 years in a bigger organization managing that larger organization. And yet people who typically have that level of experience are by that point pretty highly paid. And therefore, when they're making a calculation, should I quit my day job and go and do a startup? Or should I just stay here and wait for my next promotion? Surprisingly few of them will choose to quit their day job. The consequence of that is that most startup founders have tremendous energy, tremendous vision, tremendous conviction, and often tremendously deep understanding of product. But they commonly have a deficit of actual management experience compared with people running traditional businesses. And the paradox is that even though you have the opportunity to be trained in the same way that a manager in a large company might do, the time scale is much shortened. Because in a company that might be growing at 10 or 15 or 20% a month, the company may well grow out of control before your skills can catch up in terms of actually being able to manage organization of that size. Now, when you see the list, and you can email me and ask for it, and I'll share it with you, of the 9 skills that I've identified as key skills, they may not seem to be too daunting. But then imagine that you yourself were creating a list of the 9 skills that are needed to be a world-class footballer or a concert violinist. It's one thing to be able to say what you need to be able to do, but it's quite another thing to be able to actually execute and do it. Now, those of you who've had venture capital investors on your board will know very much that it's a common message from VCs to say, we are here to add value. We are here to help you. And it's true that it's been an increasing trend over the past 5 years that venture funds will employ people whose job is just to help their portfolio companies with different things. Now, it's important, however, to be a little bit realistic about what expectations you can fairly have of that board member. And even if they said, when they made the investment, call me anytime, any problem you've got, I'm happy to help, I think it's probably fair to focus on the fact that a typical partner in a venture firm may well be taking 4 or 5 meetings a day from new companies that they're visiting, that they're meeting for potential investment, and that the time that they have left over for you is going to be somewhat limited. Think about it like this. In a typical venture portfolio, it's often tempting, and inexperienced VC investors suffer from this, to spend a lot of time trying to fix the worst companies that are really struggling. And the more experienced firms and the more experienced investors realize that what they really need to do is focus on the top quartile, because those companies are the ones that can make the biggest difference. VCs talk about fund returners. Fund returner is a company where the likely return from the investment that they've made in that single company could be the value of the entire fund that they have to invest. And so if your company is a potential fund returner, then you're very likely to be able to expect some love from your VC. Of course, if things are going well, then your investors are likely to be delighted that you can get on with it without too much interference from themselves. And they tend to focus their efforts on those where the company is growing like crazy, but the management team has some challenges. So what are the implications for you? Well, I would suggest that the conclusions that you can draw from this are as follows. First, you should expect your venture investors to be reactive rather than proactive. They're very smart and they're very professional people. So if you call them with a question or a problem, they're likely to be able to give you a good opinion quickly. And that's what's more, will be an opinion that's based on a good number of experiences with other similar portfolio companies. But if you're expecting that they are going to be, as it were, your personal mentor, the person who will help you grow into a CEO who used to have the skills to manage 10 people and now has the skills to manage 100 or 1,000 people, that's not necessarily a fair expectation to have. So the conclusion for you probably is that what you need to do in growing a business is to be open enough and self-challenging enough to look at yourself as a manager, to audit the skills that you've got, and to come up with a plan for how you're going to build the skills where you're weaker and enhance the bits that you're really good at. And to be fair to your investors, not to expect that a VC fund can provide all those services. Of course, that raises a crucially important question, which is as follows, that you cannot really think that fully opening up to an investor on your board will necessarily be in your interests. And here's why that is. Imagine that you've had a really terrible month. 3 bad things have happened. And then today, Friday, a 4th catastrophic thing has happened. And it's really dented your confidence in your ability to run this business. Well, it's not surprising then if you say, I'm not really sure whether I'm cut out for this. Maybe I made a mistake quitting that successful job I had in that other company. Maybe this was all a big mistake. Maybe this wasn't the right startup to be running. Maybe I'm not suited to running this startup. And if you call a VC who's on your board at 11 o'clock on a Friday night and express those concerns, you should expect a sympathetic hearing. But remember that what is said cannot be unsaid. And that when you've expressed those kind of existential doubts, it's quite difficult to come back and to say afterwards, well, actually, I've changed my mind. I'm sure this business can be worth $5 billion, and let's raise another round. So the implications I would suggest are, first, that as a company founder or CEO, you have to accept that there will be skills that you don't have that you have to build. Second, that you cannot reasonably expect to build those skills with the venture capitalists who sit on your board. And third, therefore, that you need to allocate time and resource to doing it elsewhere. Now, the obvious way in which to do that is with a CEO coach. But I think the issue is that the coaching industry has perhaps got a bit of a bad name because many people who coach CEOs have as their primary qualification a PhD in psychology. They treat it almost as a matter of pride to know actually nothing about startups, about your company, about what you do, about venture capital, about how investors behave, about what you will need to do to exit from your business. And they behave almost as if there's a point of ideological purity in not competing with you with any knowledge. I have a very different perspective because what I've seen from the dozen or so CEOs that I work with is that actually it's crucially important to know how investors, both your existing investors and future investors, will react to the decisions that you might make. And it's also crucially important to be able to look at a situation and to make sure that the one or two options that you may have considered are actually the complete set of options. And what I often find is that startup founders will discover from looking at the experiences of other companies or seeing what's happened with the portfolios of other venture capital firms, that there are things that they could do that they hadn't necessarily considered. Now, one way to do this is, as I said, by working with a coach, as long as the coach has got the required expertise specific to startups and specific to the stage of the business that you're in. Another possibility is to work with a seed investor, a high net worth individual who's got plenty of free time and who wants to help you build the business. But it's important to be aware of what the bargain really needs to be, because a reasonable commitment from that person is probably going to be 50 hours a year. And it's not going to be the occasional cup of coffee once every few weeks or a lunch once a quarter. And what's more, you need to be aware of the potential conflicts if that person is also going to be an investor in your company. Because nothing is harder than separating the question, how can I help this person do the best possible job as CEO, from the very different question of, is this person the right person to be CEO? And would the shareholders be better served by replacing them? So the conclusion I draw from this is that you can do it independently as a CEO. But what you'll need to do is sit down and carefully structure your thoughts about the skills you hope to build and the steps you hope to take to build those skills. But whichever way you choose, I would say good luck, and I hope that it goes well. Now, if you have any questions, please feel free to mention them in the chat. You can also reach out to me directly. As I said, my email is tim@walking.vc. But what I know from Upstart is that there's lots and lots of very smart people here, and there's lots of great opportunities to build exciting businesses. Thank you very much. Now, if we have a couple of minutes left and you'd like to ask a question which you'd like me to answer out loud, then please go ahead and just type it in to the chat. So I have a question from Peter Stahl on tips to find a CEO coach. I'd be happy to talk about some people that I know and my own experiences, and you can email me on the address that I gave earlier. Sebastian was talking about his primary challenge of helping his salespeople working more systematically. I think that's an interesting example of one of the key skills which I've identified, which is about how to effectively manage people in one-on-one sessions. That if you're a CEO, then you may have somebody who's in charge of sales. And if you do, then it's your job not so much to do the role of sales manager for them, but instead to actually help them do the job effectively. And we could have a separate discussion about what are the ingredients of a one-on-one in which you're coaching and training and supporting somebody doing a specific job. Now, I'm conscious that we're running out of time here. It's Tim at, I'm just going to type it in here. It's Tim at walking.vc. And I think we're running out of time here. So I will say goodbye, and I will say that I hope that you, like me, will hugely enjoy the rest of the Upstart day. Many thanks indeed.